Welcome, everyone. We are so thankful that you are joining us. I am absolutely over the moon and honored, so happy to introduce to you our special guest today, Dr. James Finley. Dr. Finley is a core teacher at the Center for Action and Contemplation. He's also a weekly podcast host of Turning to the Mystics. He calls this his monastery in cyberspace. And for nearly 6 years, Dr. Finley was a monk at the Trappist monastery, the Abbey of Gethsemani in Kentucky. And while there, his spiritual director was Thomas Merton. For nearly 3 decades, Dr. Finley has led weekend retreats on contemplation, and also he has authored many spiritual classics. Next year, we're very fortunate that his teaching memoir will release from Orbis. Presently retired from his work as a clinical psychologist, Dr. Finley mostly is helping adult survivors of trauma who want their spirituality to be a resource in their healing. Dr. Finley, Jim, I am absolutely thrilled that you graciously accepted my invitation. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you. Glad we can do this together. It pleases me. Thank you.
I wanted to start with thinking back on your time at the Abbey of Gethsemani. You have so many precious stories to tell about Thomas Merton and your time together learning from him about contemplative living and mystical traditions. And I wondered if you would feel like sharing what meant much to you during that time.
Well, I think for me, growing up at home in Akron, Ohio, I was the oldest of 6 children. My father was a violent alcoholic. My mother was a devout Catholic. And I think through her, my spirituality became like a sustaining force in my life, like God sustaining me in the trauma. And it was in the midst of that I was in a 9th grade class, at a religion class at this Catholic high school I was going to. And he talked about monasteries. And I'd never heard of monasteries before. And mentioned Thomas Merton, this Trappist monk who writes these books on prayer and spirituality. So that day after school, I went to the school library, and there was one book by him in the library, The Sign of Jonas, which is a journal that he kept in the monastery. And on the very first page of that journal, Merton writes, as for me, I have but one desire, the desire for solitude, to disappear into the secret of God's face. And at 14, I didn't know what it meant, but something in me did and said, me too. That whatever that is, that poetic language of heightened presence or oneness spoke very deeply to me. And so for the next 4 years of high school, I kept reading Merton regularly and felt called to go to the monastery. My dream was to sit at his feet and have him guide me into the secret of God's face. And so when I graduated from high school in 1961, I went to Gethsemani and I entered and was there for about 6 years. And this cloistered monastery. And he was my novice master, which meant for about 2.5 of those years, I had regular one-on-one spiritual direction from him. And so that's how all of it came about, really.
That is such a rich path. And I'm wondering, when you first met Thomas Merton, I believe I would have been bowled over. How did you feel when you first got to know him? And what sorts of interactions did you have with him? I think we love your stories.
Yes. When I went in to see him for the first time, he was a numinous figure for me. It felt like going in to see Moses or coming down from the mountain kind of thing. And because of my trauma history, I just turned 18. I was right out of high school. I was so nervous. I was hyperventilating, had a hard time talking. And he wanted to know what's going on. And I said my voice was shaking. And I said, I'm scared because you're Thomas Merton. And at the time I worked at the pig barn. They had a big farm operation there. And instead of commenting on my nervousness, he said, under obedience, I want you to end afternoon work early. And before we go to Vespers, I want you to come in here and just tell me one thing that happened at the pig barn each day. And I can remember the voice inside said, I can do that. Like, I can handle that. And I would go in and we would talk about the pigs and farm operations and talking. It was very funny. He'd make jokes about it and members of the community. And that leveled the playing field for me, really, because he had compassion on me. And that opened me up to talk about my desire for God that was awakened in me in reading his books. And in the cloistered silence of the monastery, turning to him to guide me into this deep kind of contemplative communion with God. And so that's how I was initiated into it. And I found too, I was surprised that when I was shaking like that in front of him, I felt so embarrassed because I wanted him to think well of me. But I found out that really, like, the deep acceptance of our poverty in the presence of God is the gate of heaven. You know, I found out that the tender-hearted mercy towards us is precious in our brokenness. That's always been an abiding lesson for me about God's presence in our life.
I absolutely love that story and how Thomas Merton said to you, under obedience. So yes. It reminds me of, if I have a student who's very stressed out, I'll say, part of your homework is drink water and rest. Oh. And I love that he said under obedience. So in other words, you as a conscientious person, you know, that was something you could turn up for and do as homework. And I'm curious what sorts of discussions you had, or what sorts of lessons did you learn? I sense from you that the overarching lesson is that Thomas Merton was a human, not to be deified, and also so very wise and very closely connected with love, and that he was open to being a human with you, a wise one. As you say, I've read you say this, and in some of our conversations, a well-seasoned beginner. So what sorts of things did you learn that you have really walked with your whole life, Jim?
Yes, I think, well, for me, what it was more than anything else is I think I saw that he embodied the timeless wisdom of contemplative Christianity. He held the lineage. He was a lineage holder in the Christian tradition, in concert with the contemplative mystical traditions of all the world's great religions. He carried on very serious dialogue with the Buddhists, with the Sufis. Abraham Joshua Heschel, the Jewish philosopher and mystic, came there to visit him. And he introduced me to yoga, the practice of deep yoga, the Bhagavad Gita. And so I saw in these mystical lineages, and the monastery was created to nurture the sense of oneness, this God's oneness with us as life itself, you know, and to give ourselves to God, who's eternally giving himself to us. And in that mutual self-donation and love, it touches the whole world in ways we don't understand. So a lot of our conversations was around that. And he once told me, he said, once in a while, you'll find someone with whom you can talk about such things, but they're hard to find. He said, that's your solitude. But you have the contemplative understanding of the scriptures, the teachings of the mystics. You have God, you have silence, you have life. And so I think that was the tone of our relationship, really. And so several months into this ongoing pattern of chanting the Psalms in silence and seeing him, I got permission from him to spend some time each day in an abandoned sheep barn that was on the property there at the monastery. And I would go there up in the loft of this barn, and I would read the Psalms. And the loft door was always open, looked out over a meadow. And one day I was walking back and forth reading the Psalms, and all of a sudden there was this vivid awareness that what we tend to think of as air is actually God, and that I was walking back and forth in God, breathing God. and that if I tried to flee from God, I'd be fleeing from God in God. And wherever I ended up, God would be waiting for me when I got there. That was the feeling that it had. But there was no need to run because there was this deep sense that God knew me through and through and through and through his mercy, like mercy, 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 mercy. It was a very powerful experience for me. And I walked around like that for several days, breathing God, like in this heightened state. I was normal. I was walking around doing manual labor and silent, but there was this like it's hard to explain. It was just an habitual state of like divinized immediacy to everything. And I was walking in the woods. It was in the and this breathing God, and went on this for I was like that for about 3 days maybe, and I was walking up to the woods to this little Dom Fredericks Lake. It's a little lake in the woods, and I was walking up this little wooded little path through the woods, breathing God, and I stopped, and there was a low hanging little branch, and I reached out and touched a leaf on the tree, and I looked up in the sky, and there was just one cloud in the sky, and I said out loud, "It's one." Like the God I was breathing, the cloud in the sky, the leaf I was touching, everything was unexplainably like one in all directions. And it changed my life. The thoroughness of that oneness changed my life. And then I was introduced by Merton to the classical texts of the mystics, St. John of the Cross and Teresa, Brother Lawrence, and Cloud of Unknowing, and so on. And I found these mystics were talking about offering trustworthy guidance in this experience. So when I left the monastery and started, I wrote Merton's Palace of Nowhere and on Merton on ultimate identity beyond the ego. And I started getting invitations to lead silent retreats. And these were people in the world coming from their homes and families and businesses who were coming to this silent retreat to have meals or in silence. And I would give talks on the mystics and touching their desire to deepen this experience of oneness. And so that became part of my life. And then early on in that, a clinical psychologist read Merton's Palace of Nowhere, invited me to give a retreat in Seattle, Washington. And at the end of the retreat, he said, if you'd be willing to make the contribution of the mystical traditions to mental health, I'll see to it that you can have a PhD degree with family support, not as a loan, just as a gift. The only thing you need to do is to demonstrate the depth dimension of the healing encounter. And so I went to Fuller Theological Seminary, that's a doctoral program in psychology, for 5 years. And I got into this practice of giving weekend silent retreats. And then during the week, sitting mainly with adult survivors of trauma who wanted spirituality to be a resource in their therapy. And that pattern moving back and forth between the retreat and the trauma, and also within myself, because I was going into therapy for my own trauma. And really, it formed my life. This place where the presence of God and pain touch each other and interpenetrate each other, and the transformative energies that's released in that for me. So my path's been very much affected by these things that happened.
This is, Jim, thank you for sharing this. This is one of the things that I know means a lot to me and so many others, is how you, as a clinical psychologist and as someone turning up to your own life and also being the person who listens and as a clinical psychologist helps others, you bring this psychological wisdom and science and the art of psychology into your study of the mystics from all backgrounds. And I've noticed this, anything I read of yours, anything I listen, like the Palace, I notice there's always this psychological wisdom. And I wondered if you could speak to, you've talked a great deal about how God often does not protect us, but sustains us. And I wonder if you could shed a little bit of light and hope and wisdom about, how we can deepen our mystical roots even during the difficult times.
Yes, I think I should say something here too also, is that when I was just beginning to form the synthesis within myself in my private practice when I graduated in my own therapy, that Tammy Simon from Sounds True with Carolyn Mace invited me to do a series of trauma and transcendence, which I did. And it became the cornerstone for a much more developed version of that I got a grant through Fetzer Institute and developed it even more. So that kind of led to kind of what does it mean to be a contemplative clinician? See, what does it mean to be a contemplative patient? Like, what's the contemplative dimension of the healing journey, and how to articulate that, and then how does that apply to daily life and so on. And so anyway, that set the stage for this. And so my sense is this, like to your question, is different ways to say it. First, I put it this way, sometimes we get the feeling that in the momentum of the day's demands, that we're skimming over the surface of the depths of our own life. And what's all the more regrettable about that is that God's unexplainable oneness with us is hidden in the depths over which we're skimming. And so we're suffering from depth deprivation, really like the homeland of this abyss-like love sustaining us breath by breath, heartbeat by heartbeat. But the challenging thing is internalized traumas and abandonments from the past. Even though those events might be in the past, they linger on within us. And to find our way down into the depths, we have to pass through the hurting places. And so what's the art form of that? Like, how do we find a way for it to be safe? What is it to know that when we risk sharing what hurts the most in the presence of someone who will not invade us or abandon us, we can learn not to invade or abandon ourselves. We can be reparented in love. And even deeper, what does it mean that when we risk sharing what hurts the most in the presence of someone who will not invade us or abandon us, we can come upon within ourselves what Jesus called the pearl of great price. It's the invincible preciousness of us, of ourselves in the midst of our pain. So it's freedom from the tyranny of suffering in the midst of suffering, freedom from the tyranny of death in the midst of death. So the idea here is that God protects us from nothing, meaning this. Any trauma survivor knows this by experience. I'll put it this way. Here in the Los Angeles area, in the greater Los Angeles area, and it's all over the world, really, there are little girls who are going to be incested again. And God's not going to stop a single one of it happening. There are little boys who are going to be severely beaten again. And God's not going to stop a single one of it. I know because I was one of them myself. And so God depends on us to do our best, to be a non-violent, nurturing, safe, protective person. Grounded in an inner peace. It's not dependent on the outcome of our efforts, because sometimes we're not going to be able to do it. So the idea then is that God protects us from nothing. This is the mystery of the cross, really. Father, if possible, let this cup pass from me. God protects us from nothing, even as God unexplainably sustains us in all things. So in the moment of my death, which is approaching even as I speak, when I breathe my last breath, I'll be unexplainably sustained by God. Because if God is Lord of life, God is Lord of death. God's the infinity of life. God's the infinity of death, the gate of heaven. So I think that's what the contemplative experience is. See, it's a depth-like groundedness in the sustaining love. Merton says it beats in our very blood whether we want it to or not. And we can, in being awakened to it, we can learn to stabilize in it. and be a healing presence in the midst of the world.
I love that, because instead of running from the pain, we can walk through it with hope and with transformation, is what you're saying. And I'm wondering, how can we then discern these moments? You spoke about being up in the abandoned sheep barn, and then you also spoke about touching that tree and everything being one. How can we recognize these moments, even if they're in the middle, even if we're not at a monastery, if we're in the middle of our day-to-day lives?
Yeah.
How can we discern when these non-depth deprivation moments, when these moments where we actually dip into the depth, how can we discern those? And as you say so eloquently, stabilize them in our lives. In other words, make us aware of them more and more often as healing, transformative, comforting. Can you speak on that a bit? Because I know you are really an expert on contemplation and trauma and living this path, Jim.
Yes. I want to go back first and clarify something about trauma first, and then move into this part. Let's say our experience of ourself and ego consciousness and our passage through sequential time from birth to death. We're on that right now together. We move through our days in the ups and downs. And as human beings, we're subject to traumas great and small that can and sometimes do occur. And when they do occur, we seek to be healed from those psychological symptoms that embody suffering. And so that horizontal line, which is a field of mental health, it's real in its own right. Feelings of self-loathing, panic attacks, suicidality, addiction, all that needs to be melt with its own. But the question is then, that horizontal line of our passage through time is intersected by a vertical divine dimension that's unexplainably sustaining us. And so what I'm exploring is how to honor that horizontal dimension in its own right, symptom reduction, panic attacks, whatever it is. But how to do it in such a way that it opens up or invites intimations of this depth dimension that a person can learn to discover in the very midst of their healing. And then once they find it, to draw upon it, to touch the hurting places with love, until the pain dissolves in love and only love is left. So there's that. But now what's also true is these awakenings occur in blissful times, in peaceful times, in the good times of life. And so the question is, how do we then recognize these times? Because they're sometimes they're very dramatic, really. They're just life-changing. But very often they're very subtle. They're very, very delicate. And if we weren't careful, we might have missed them. So Thomas Merton, how I usually introduce this with people, in the last chapter, New Seeds of Contemplation, Thomas Merton says, "The world and time are the dance of the Lord in emptiness. The silence of the spheres is the music of a wedding feast." So there he bears witness to the mystery of incarnate infinity, the mystery that the world is God's body, that it's bodying forth the love that's uttering it into being. So this is stones and trees and stars and the darkness of the night and so on. Our faith, illumined by faith, is a kind of an obscure certainty, or Gabriel Marcel calls it a primitive inner assurance that this is so. And in our Christian dispensation, we recognize this in Christ. The Word was made flesh and dwelt among us. And so we live this life of faith, and God sustains us and guides us in our faith and so on. From time to time, we are granted moments of quickening. Merton says, he says in New Seeds of Contemplation at the end there of the book, he says, you're out, let's say you're out walking somewhere in the midst of nature, and you turn to see a flock of birds descending. And as if out of the corner of your eye, you catch something in their descent that's primordial, vast, and true. And that somehow The birds in the descent is somehow the manifested presence of God manifesting herself as the bird's descent. See? Sometimes too, it can come to us in moments of intimacy with another person. There are moments between two people of communal oneness. And in the communal oneness with each other, they sense that their oneness with each other is subsisting in an infinite love, like light subsists in flame. And their love incarnates this infinite love, giving itself to them as their love for each other. Merton says it comes to us in a moment with children when they are really children. They can wash over you reading a small child a good night story. And you get this sense that when you're in the presence of the child, you're in the presence of God. It can come to us at a quiet hour at day's end, at a pause between two lines of a poem. It comes as it comes. It touches us and awakens us. So when it's actually happening, it's too deep to comprehend. It's too self-evident to doubt. It's a state of amazement. It's a momentary state of amazement that in some mysterious way, that nothing's missing anywhere. What a fool I am to worry so, the way I sometimes do, like that. These moments, they pass. They tend to be fleeting. And so the question is, what happens next? Well, a lot of times nothing happens next. The cell phone goes off. We go to the grocery store and there you go. But sometimes what happens is it hallows all of life. Like it illumines our faith. So everything becomes kind of translucent to this oneness that you know in your heart. In other words, there's the intuition that in the fleeting awakening, it isn't as if something more was given to you, but you fleetingly taste the divine generosity that every moment is. Like it's always there permeating the ordinary, like you know it in your heart. I will not play the cynic. See, I will not break faith with my awakened heart. I know that it's true. And for some people, what happens is these touches of oneness, it awakens a desire, a longing to abide in the depths so fleetingly glimpsed, which is the impetus for the path. There was this moment of unexplainable oneness. St. Augustine says, God closer to us than we are to ourselves. And then we realize in being touched by it, as the experience dissipated, it left in our heart a desire for it. Where can I find somebody well seasoned in such things to guide me in this? And this is where we find it so amazing to discover the mystics. Because when we pick up the mystics and read them, you can tell they're talking about this experience and they're offering guidance in how to find one's way to an habitual, underlying, stabilized state to be this awakened person in the midst of the world for the sake of the world, like that. And so that's the way that I would put it. So actually, it isn't as if sometimes these amazing things do happen to us, really, they're life-changing. But I think what it really is we're learning to calibrate our heart to an ever finer scale. See, to pick up something glimpsed in the descent of birds, see, or in a small child's upturned face, or in the smell of a rose. And we know that it's the divinity of everything intimately realized. So how can I abide in it? See, because it's elusive. And I realize it doesn't lie in my power to abide in it. And this is where meditation practice comes in. Meditation practice, I can assume the stance that offers the least resistance to being overtaken by what we cannot attain. See, we cannot attain it, but it attains us in our powerlessness to attain it, like this. And this is meditation practice. So meditation practice, then, Thomas Merton once said, with God, a little sincerity goes a long, long way. It's like a rendezvous with God, like, here I am, Lord, like this. And one grounds oneself in the practice so that over time, in fidelity to the practice, that deepening sense of oneness can start showing up here and there throughout the day. And that's following the path. How to be a contemplative woman, a contemplative man in the midst of the world.
That is a lot to unpack and said so beautifully, Jim. I love that XY axis and how where they intersect, we have this state of amazement, which sometimes for me is like if I'm pouring sugar from one place to another, a big old 5-pound sack of sugar, and I'm like, that's such a beautiful sound. It's just sugar.
Yeah,
But it's an absolutely beautiful way that you put it. You make it seem absolutely very accessible for anyone to discover and stabilize this way of having the least resistance to allowing this awareness. So do you have any other words on that? Because I think one of the things I relate to the most in your teaching and have for years, you're kind of like my Thomas Merton, but one of the things I've really related to is how you say we don't need to, and really, we need to find someone to help us to walk through any trauma or difficulties that we're having, but that those are actually also the path. They're not mistakes. They're
right.
actually the path. And I know you've lived this out in your life and written about it so lyrically. Do you have advice for someone wondering where to start? Or
Well, I think this podcast I do with Kristen Oates on Turning to the Mystics, and they're intentionally like 20, 30-minute, very poetic, simple. And so what you do is you find, what you do is I think you find a voice, and I would think there would be people listening to our dialogue who would find in our dialogue an example of this. And you can tell as you listen to it or read it that it's beautiful. And in your heart, it's beautiful because it's true. So Thomas Merton once said, the very fact you're seeking God means you've already found God, or better yet, God's already found you. So it's the gift of the sincerity of the longing itself is the way. So then you say, well, what am I to do with this longing? And what one does is, this is how I put it, I find helpful, is to practice your practice and practice it. Find your teaching and follow it, and find your community and enter it. So a practice is any act faithfully entered into with your whole heart that takes you to the deeper place. See? Vulnerability in an intimate love relationship, one's relationship with one's children, the long, slow walks to no place in particular, tending the roses, lying awake at night in the middle of the night in the dark. See? What are the acts which, when you give yourself over to them unexplainably, there's a kind of a qualitative descent into it, a deeper awareness of and oneness with ever deeper dimensions of the intimate immediacy of the moment that you're in, like a stone falling in water. And you realize you're descending into the bottomless abyss of God's presence, welling up and giving itself to you as this moment. And so what you do then is you find a way that for you, and I think for most people then, the practice is any practice. So it might start as Lectio Divina, like the prayerful reading, and then meditatio, reflecting upon it, then prayer, help me with this. Then you may feel moved towards more wordless forms of prayer, the awareness of the breath, the cloud of unknowing. And reading in the mystics where they talk about these quickenings. This. So find your practice and practice it. And eventually all life becomes practice, eventually. Find your teaching and follow it. And the teaching is any teaching that bears witness to this. See? It's any teaching. Sometimes certain poets are like this also. And the contemplative reading of, the contemplative hearing of everything Jesus says is this. And so you find your teaching, it bears witness to this, and then offers guidance in it. It's bearing witness to the unexplainable, the all-encompassing divinity of every moment. It bears witness. And then it offers guidance in how to pursue it like this. And and then eventually you realize that life is your teacher. That life itself is our teacher. If we learn to surrender ourselves over to life, So we practice our practice, and then all life becomes practice. Over the arc of our years, it's a lifetime thing. And we find our teaching, we realize we're being taught constantly. Even the sound of sugar pouring out of a sack is teaching us like that, whatever. And then find our community and enter it. And the community is just one other person in whose presence you're not alone on this path. Maybe you're married to such a person, lucky you. Maybe they're a good friend. Maybe it's someone who's far off, but you keep in touch with each other. But also, you open up the mystics, and even though they've been dead for years, their deathless presence shines through everything they say, like this. Because we're all siblings of this infinite love. And we learn to trust our own paced way of letting the whole world then become our community. It lays claim on our heart, like the beauty of just the beauty of the world, as God so loved the world that He sent His only begotten Son. So those are some guidelines that help me, when I work with people, also to how each person finds his or her own way to their practice, their teaching, and their community.
I love that you make it so adaptable. You have a few principles, but it's very adaptable to the person. So it's not like they need to have a checklist of doing exactly some formula. And that reminds me, and I want to make sure we get to talk just a little bit as we close down about your upcoming memoir. I think this memoir that's releasing next year is beautiful. You call it a teaching memoir. And there are many passages in it that really spoke to me. But you say in the introduction, here's how you describe it: these reflections mark out a path, a way of life in which we as human beings are healed from all that hinders us from experiencing the steady, strong currents of divinity that flow on and on in the bittersweet alchemy of our lives. Yeah. I have loved all of your books, and I really think this one is my favorite now, because it really speaks into the moment we're all living through of collective trauma and many, many crises. You say, the door that grants access to boundaryless fulfillment is hidden in the unfinished business of our lives. That is such a word of hope to me, Jim. I appreciate that you have spent several years crafting this teaching memoir and including also practices in it that we can do as we read it. It's an accomplishment like nothing I've ever seen before.
Yes, at the time I was in the midst of writing another book on the audio files on the contemplative dimensions of healing. And I was really struggling with it. I didn't know why. It went on for quite a while. And I wrote this book. Maureen, my wife, she died 2 years ago of Alzheimer's, and she died right here in the living room. There was a hospice bed put up in the living room here. And so I wrote the introduction sitting next to her as she was dying. And I think what happened there unexpectedly is the rawness of the experience and the love that we shared opened up a deep voice inside of me. And see, where does joy and sorrow and birth and death, the alchemy, the grace, the steady, strong currents of divinity that flow on and on. And so what's the artistry of learning to discern that flow, and then like the Tao, like moving with it. And the book just flowed out that way for me. It was really such a grace for me to share that and experience that.
It is beautiful. I mean, every page is lyrical and wise and practical. Lyrical, wise, and practical. It's simply amazing to me. Do you want, as we close out, I'm really sad to see this conversation come to an end, but would you like to tell our listeners where they can find your podcast, Turning to the Mystics, and any last word you'd like to share, Jim?
Yes. Well, first of all, if it goes Center for Action and Contemplation, Richard Rohr's website, the Living School, and just the other offerings that are there, and you type in James Finley and you'll see the podcast there. Also, if you go to jamesfinley.org, Or also, if you go to Turning to the Mystics, James Finley, you can find it and upload as a podcast, and that's how you find them. I think we went through Thomas Merton, Teresa of Avila, John of the Cross, Cloud of Unknowing, Guigo, The Ladder to Heaven, and we're just now starting Julian of Norwich. And it's been a big response to it. People are touched by it. I think people are longing for guidance and deepening this sense of God's presence in our life. So that'd be places they could go. And then the Orbis books will be publishing in the spring of next year. There's no definite date set yet. But anyway, that's where they could go. And also, if they go on YouTube, you put in James Finley videos. There's just tons of pirated talks on there. I mean, I don't know how they got there, but there's just a lot of talks that I've given here and there in different places. They just showed up there. So anyway, just that. Yeah.
So Center for Action. So all people really need to do is to Google Center for Action and Contemplation and James Finley.
Yes.
And Turning to the Mystics and James Finley, and it all comes up.
Or they can go directly to on Google, YouTube. They can go directly to Turning to the Mystics, James Finley. Either way, it'll bring up it'll bring it. And then I think on CAC's website, they get my other audio sets that I did there on Indestructible Joy of Meister Eckhart, and The Path Through the Palace of Nowhere on Merton that I did with Sounds True. And Sounds True is also Eckhart, but then also Jesus and Buddha, and Intimacy, the Divine Ambush, St. John of the Cross that I did with Richard. So they'll see those other things there. And I would say, as a parting word, I would say this. And in our talks, I shared this with you. I was so, you sent me a copy of your translation of The Cloud, and so touched by the clarity of the voice, the truth of it, that mystic voice, and just the authenticity of your own journey, like one contemplative teacher to another. And also in opportunities like this, where seekers have a chance to share in these things through this, like a technology in the service of spiritual awakening like this. And so, what a grace, really, for us, and to be able to share like this.
Dr. James Finley. Jim, your work, your life, your testimony to the contemplative path have meant so much to me and to so very many others. Those in your cyberspace monastery on Turning to the Mystics. I want to thank you for accepting my invitation and coming on, for your time. And we all love you. Thank you so much, Jim.
Thank you so much.
What a great session with Dr. James Finley. Thank you all so much for listening.